The moment Sadie Gentry rode into Dustcreek, Texas, with nothing but a saddlebag full of broken promises and a heart still raw from betrayal, she had no idea that the quiet, sun-bronzed man leaning against the post outside the general store would be the one to put her back together again. The year was 1878, and Dustcreek sat baking under a relentless August sun in the western reaches of Texas, a town barely old enough to have a proper church but already seasoned enough to have 3 saloons, a sheriff with a bad knee, and more gossip than a city twice its size. The land was a sprawling canvas of red dust and limestone rock, broken by stands of mesquite, and the occasional silver ribbon of a creek that only ran when it felt like it. It was the kind of place a person either grew roots in or ran from, and Sadie Gentry had spent the last 4 years running. She was 23 years old with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, green eyes that had seen more disappointment than they should have, and hands that were rougher than most men in town gave her credit for. She had grown up on a homestead outside of Abilene, learned to ride before she could read, and had married young to a man named Clem Hatch who turned out to be a liar, a drinker, and eventually a man who disappeared west with another woman's money and Sadie's last shred of trust. The divorce had been messy, quiet, and whispered about in ways that made her feel like a walking scandal every time she stepped foot in town. So she had left Abilene entirely, spending the past 8 months drifting from one settlement to the next, doing laundry, mending clothes, cooking for boarding houses, doing whatever honest work she could find. A woman she had met in a boarding house in San Angelo had told her about Dustcreek, said the town had a seamstress shop that had recently gone without an owner because the woman who ran it had passed away unexpectedly in the spring, said the building was available for a modest rent, and that the town was growing fast enough that there was real money to be made if a person knew how to work with needle and thread. Sadie knew how to do both, and so she had pointed her horse east and ridden until the cluster of wooden buildings appeared against the flat horizon like a mirage that turned out to be real. The man leaning against the post outside the general store had not looked up when she rode in. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with a lean build that suggested years of labor rather than ease. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a face that was angular and weathered, not unhandsome, with dark brown eyes that were currently fixed on something he was reading. He had a deputy's star pinned to his shirt, she noticed, and a pistol on his hip that looked well used but well maintained. When her horse stopped at the hitching post nearby, he finally glanced up from whatever he was reading, and for just a moment their eyes met. He nodded. She nodded back. She tied off her horse and walked inside the general store, and that was how Sadie Gentry first laid eyes on Roscoe Easton. Inside the store, a broad man with a red mustache and an apron tied around his considerable middle was arranging cans on a shelf. He introduced himself as Eli Drummond, the storekeeper, and when Sadie told him she was looking for the empty seamstress shop, his face opened up into a wide and genuine smile. "You're a seamstress?" he asked, already moving toward the counter to write something down. "I am," Sadie said. "And I do alterations, dress goods, and custom work for gentlemen's attire if needed." "Lord knows this town needs you," Eli said. "We've had ladies riding all the way to San Angelo just to get a proper dress made for weddings and such. My own wife has been complaining about it for 2 years." He told her where the shop was, 2 buildings down from the saloon on the main street, and said the landlord was a man named Harold Fisk who had a small ranch outside of town and came in on Thursdays. It was Tuesday, so Sadie had 2 days to look the place over before she could sign anything. Eli kindly offered to let her board with his family until she got settled, an offer that struck her as so unexpectedly generous that she felt something loosen in her chest just slightly. She thanked him and walked back out into the blazing afternoon sun. The deputy was still there, but now he was talking to another man, a stocky fellow with a red bandana around his neck. When Sadie stepped down from the boardwalk to check on her horse, she heard the stocky man say something loud and unflattering about a group of Apache men she had passed on the road coming into town. They had been riding peacefully, several miles distant, and had paid her no attention at all. "Ought to be run off entirely," the stocky man said. "This whole stretch of country needs to be cleared out properly." Sadie watched the deputy, watched the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing for a moment, then spoke in a low, even voice. "Those men have as much right to ride the open range as you do, Chester. More, depending on how you count the years." Chester made a noise of disagreement and walked off. The deputy watched him go, then looked back down at whatever he had been reading, and Sadie found herself studying his profile for just a moment too long before she looked away and busied herself checking her saddlebag. She stayed with the Drummond family that night, sleeping in a narrow room above the store that smelled of dried herbs and cedar wood. It was the best sleep she had gotten in months. Over the following 2 days, Sadie explored the small shop and found it to be structurally sound, decently lit from 2 front windows, and furnished with a large cutting table, shelving along the walls, and an old treadle sewing machine that still worked beautifully when she oiled the mechanisms and tested it. There was a back room with a small wood stove and enough space for a cot, which would serve as living quarters until she could afford something better. She swept every corner twice, scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, and by the time Harold Fisk arrived on Thursday morning, the shop looked as clean and ready as if it had never been closed. Harold Fisk was a quiet, fair man who asked her several pointed questions about her business experience and her intentions for the shop, all of which she answered directly and honestly. He set the monthly rent. She agreed to it, and by noon on Thursday she had signed her name on a rental agreement and had the key in her hand. Standing alone in that small, sunlit shop with the key pressed between her palms, Sadie Gentry felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It took less than a week for her first customer to arrive. A woman named Berta Hollins came in needing a wedding dress altered because she had bought one second-hand from a catalog, and it was 2 sizes too large and several inches too long. Sadie took her measurements, quoted a fair price, and had the dress finished in 4 days. Berta told everyone she knew, and within 2 weeks, the small shop had a steady stream of customers coming through the door. Sadie worked from sunup to well past sundown most days. She ordered fabric through Eli's store, kept her ledger carefully, and allowed herself small luxuries, a better pillow, a proper oil lamp, a few kitchen items so she could cook her own meals in the back room. The town was beginning to know her face, and most folks were kind, though she noticed the particular way certain women looked at her when they learned she was divorced, that careful, cautious look that said they were deciding how much to trust her. She did not let it bother her. She had come here to build something, and she intended to do exactly that. It was during her 3rd week in Dustcreek that she had her first real conversation with Roscoe Easton. She was carrying a bolt of calico from Eli's store back to her shop, and the bolt was heavier and more awkward than she had expected. She had made it about 15 steps from the store before she nearly dropped it, fumbling to get a better grip, and then there were 2 strong hands appearing from her left, steadying the bolt without a word. "Let me," said a quiet, deep voice, and she looked up to find the deputy standing right beside her. "I had it," she said, though this was not entirely true. "You almost didn't," he replied, and there was nothing unkind in his voice. He was simply stating a fact. She considered arguing, then decided against it. "Thank you," she said, and they walked the short distance to her shop in a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. He set the bolt down on her cutting table with the ease of a man accustomed to physical work and straightened up, looking around the shop with honest curiosity. It was clean and organized, bolts of fabric arranged by color, thread in tidy rows, a small vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that she had put there because she refused to let the space feel entirely utilitarian. "You've done well with this place," he said. "Mrs. Hayward, the woman who had it before, she kept it just as tidy." "She was a good woman. Did you know her?" Sadie asked, surprising herself with the ease of the question. "She made a shirt for my father once," he said. "Nicest shirt he ever owned. He wore it to his grave." He said this without self-pity, just plainly, the way a person speaks about hard facts when they have made their peace with them. "I'm sorry about your father," she said. He nodded once. "I'm Roscoe Easton, deputy sheriff." "Sadie Gentry," she said. "Seamstress." He shook her hand, which was unusual enough in itself, because most men in Dustcreek tipped their hats to women and kept their hands to themselves unless it was a formal occasion. His grip was firm and brief, and his hand was warm. He left without making any kind of occasion of it, walking back out into the afternoon sun without a backward glance, and Sadie watched him go for a moment before turning back to her work. She told herself she was simply noting that he seemed decent, and that decency was a quality worth noting in a town full of rough edges. Over the next several weeks, she noticed him in the way you notice the details of a landscape that you cross every day. He was methodical and calm in his work. She saw that much. The kind of man who settled disputes by talking rather than reaching for iron. She watched him once diffuse a fight outside the saloon between two cowboys who had gotten deep into the whiskey, and even deeper into an argument about cattle prices. He walked between them unhurried, and by the time he was done talking, both men were sitting down and neither one had thrown a punch. She heard things about him from others, too, the way you learn about people in a small town whether you ask or not. Eli told her that Roscoe had been deputy for 2 years, having come to Dustcreek from a ranch further north after his father passed, and the ranch had to be sold to cover debts. He had a sister in Fort Worth who was married with 3 children. He had a reputation for fairness that stretched far enough that even people who did not particularly like him respected him. There was also a woman named Geneva Alcott, whom Sadie heard about from 3 different people in the same week. Geneva was 28, the daughter of the town's largest landowner, and she had set her intentions on Roscoe Easton so clearly that most of Dustcreek considered the two of them as good as spoken for, even though no engagement had been announced. Sadie filed this information away without particular feeling about it. It was none of her business who the deputy was involved with, and she had not come to Dustcreek looking for that kind of complication. But Dustcreek, as it turned out, had its own ideas about how things should unfold. The trouble started in October, when a man rode into town that Sadie had not seen in 2.5 years. She recognized him from across the street before she could even make out his face clearly, something about the way he sat his horse, the tilt of his hat, the bored arrogance of a man who had never learned that the world did not owe him patience. It was Clem Hatch. Her stomach dropped through the floor of her chest and landed somewhere around her knees. She stepped back into the shadow of her doorway and watched him ride past, praying with everything she had that he would not look her way. He did not. He rode straight to the saloon, tied off his horse, and went inside. Sadie spent the rest of the afternoon with her hands shaking so badly she ruined 2 seams she had to carefully pick out and redo. She told herself it was just the surprise of it, just the simple startle of an unexpected sight. She told herself that he could not touch her, that the divorce was legal, that she was not his wife and not his property, that she had every right to be here and he had none over her. By evening, when she closed up the shop and stepped outside, she nearly walked directly into Clem Hatch. He was standing on the boardwalk outside her shop, leaning against the post with a lazy smile that she remembered hating long before she had a name for what she felt about it. He was 30 years old, broader than she remembered, with a reddish beard and small, pale eyes that moved over her in a way that made her skin feel wrong. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Little Sadie Gentry, heard you were around here somewhere." "Heard from who?" she asked, keeping her voice level by main force of will. He shrugged. "Word gets around. You're doing real well for yourself, looks like, your own shop and everything." "What do you want, Clem?" He smiled again, and it did not reach his eyes. "Just passing through. No need to be unfriendly, we were married once. Once is the key word, she said. Good evening. She stepped past him and walked quickly down the boardwalk toward Eli's store, where she had gotten into the habit of stopping in the evenings to pick up whatever small supply she needed. She heard him call after her, something light and careless, but she did not turn around. Eli was behind the counter when she came in, and she must have looked shaken because he set down his ledger immediately and asked her what was wrong. She told him briefly and factually, watching his expression shift from surprise to quiet anger. "You want me to say something to Roscoe?" he asked. "No," she said quickly. "He's probably just passing through. He said he was." But she slept badly that night, and the next morning when she opened her shop, there was a folded piece of paper tucked under the door. She opened it and read it 3 times before she felt the full cold weight of what it said settle over her. Clem had not left town. He had written, in his uneven hand, that he was owed money from the period before their divorce, that he had consulted with a man in San Angelo about certain legal claims on the property of a former spouse, and that if she was interested in avoiding any unpleasantness, they should talk. It was not a legal threat. She knew enough to know that, the divorce had been clean, and he had no legitimate claim on anything she owned. But it was the kind of threat that did not need to be legal to cause damage. In a town where she was still new, where women's reputations were fragile things, a man making noise about a divorced woman could do real harm to everything she had worked to build. She sat down on her stool behind the cutting table and breathed carefully, looking at the morning light coming through the front windows, the bolts of fabric in their neat rows, the dried wildflowers still holding their shape. She had not survived Clem Hatch once by falling apart. She folded the paper neatly, put it in her apron pocket, and when the door opened at 9 o'clock and her first customer of the day came in, she greeted her with a steady smile and got to work. It was Roscoe who found out about it, not from her, but from Chester, the loud, stocky man who seemed to take pleasure in telling anyone who would listen that Sadie Gentry's disreputable former husband had come to Dustcreek and was making claims on her. Roscoe heard it late in the day, standing outside the sheriff's office talking to Sheriff Alderman, and something in his expression went very quiet and very still in the way that things do when a decision is being made without ceremony. He came to her shop the next morning just as she was unlocking the door. "I heard about your former husband," he said without preamble, but not unkindly. "I wanted you to know that if he causes you any trouble, legal or otherwise, I will deal with it." She turned to look at him. The morning sun was at his back and he was holding his hat, turning it in his hands in a way that was the only outward sign of any discomfort. His dark eyes were direct and serious. "He hasn't done anything actionable," she said. "Yet," Roscoe said. She considered him for a moment. "I don't need protection, Mr. Easton. I've been managing my own troubles for a long time." "I know you have," he said. "I respect that, but managing on your own and having someone in your corner are not the same thing, and you're allowed to have both." She had not expected that. She had expected the kind of helping offer that was really about the man's own need to feel useful, the kind she had learned to deflect gracefully. This was something different. He was not offering to solve her problem. He was offering to stand beside her while she solved it herself. She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "Clem Hatch has a reputation in 3 counties, Roscoe told her, his voice still matter-of-fact. "Fraud, mostly. He's clever enough to stay just inside the law, but only just. If he makes any formal claim against you, it will not hold up, and if he tries anything outside the law, he'll answer for it." She nodded. "I appreciate you telling me that." He put his hat back on. "I'll keep an eye on things," he said, and walked back down the boardwalk in the early morning quiet. Sadie went inside and stood for a moment with her hand on the cutting table, feeling something she did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite relief, and it was not quite warmth, or perhaps it was a combination of both, the feeling of discovering that the ground beneath your feet was more solid than you had thought. Clem came to the shop that afternoon, and she was almost glad of it because it meant she did not have to dread the moment of his arrival anymore. He came in with that same lazy ease, looking around at her work with an expression of vague condescension. "Nice place," he said. "You always were handy with a needle. Say what you came to say, Clem." He spread his hands in a show of reasonableness. "I'm just thinking we could reach some kind of settlement. I put years into that marriage too, Sadie. A man deserves some consideration." "You left me," she said evenly. "You left with another woman's savings and did not tell me you were going. The divorce was finalized by a judge. There is nothing to settle. Now the law is a funny thing," he started. "It is not that funny," said a quiet voice from the doorway. Both of them looked. Roscoe was standing in the open door, not aggressively, not with his hand near his weapon, just present, arms loose at his sides, expression perfectly calm. "Deputy Easton," Clem said carefully. "Mr. Hatch," Roscoe replied. "I've had occasion to look into your history this morning. Interesting reading." He paused. "There's a warrant for your arrest in Bixar County. Fraud, specifically relating to a property claim you made against a woman in San Antonio last spring. Seems the judge there takes a dim view of men who attempt to extort money from their former wives." The color moved through Clem's face in interesting ways. He looked at Sadie, then at Roscoe, then at Sadie again. "I was just having a conversation," he said. "You're welcome to continue having it," Roscoe said pleasantly. "From the county jail in Bexar." Clem straightened. For a moment Sadie thought he might try something foolish, and from the way Roscoe's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, she thought he was thinking the same thing. But Clem was, in the end, a man who avoided direct confrontation whenever there was an easier option. He left. He left Dustcreek before sundown, and Sadie watched him ride out from the window of her shop with a feeling that was less triumph than simple, profound relief. The way you feel when a storm you have been watching on the horizon finally changes direction and moves away. She went to find Roscoe later that evening. He was sitting on the bench outside the sheriff's office, reading again, that same steady calm he always seemed to carry with him. Was there actually a warrant? She asked, sitting down on the bench beside him, which was bold enough that she noticed it even as she did it. He looked up at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest to one she had seen on him. "There was," he said. "I sent a telegram to Bixar County on Monday just to see what came back." She shook her head slowly. "You were looking into him before he even came to the shop." "I thought it might be useful," he said simply. She sat with that for a moment. The evening air was beginning to cool, which was a mercy after the day's heat, and the sky above the rooftops was turning the color of a bruised peach. From somewhere down the street came the distant sound of a piano from inside the saloon, a jaunty, slightly out-of-tune melody that seemed to belong exactly to this place and time. "Thank you," she said again, and this time it carried more weight than the first time she had said it, because now she meant it for more than just the morning's good intentions. He looked at her steadily. "You built something here," he said. "Seems worth protecting." She was not entirely sure whether he meant the shop or something else, and she was not entirely sure she wanted to ask. She went back to her shop and sat at her treadle machine and sewed until the oil lamp burned low. And the whole time she worked, she was aware of a warmth somewhere behind her sternum that had not been there the week before. November came in on a cold wind that turned the dust in the street to mud and set the mesquite trees rattling their seed pods like small dry instruments. Sadie bought a better wood stove for the back room of her shop and acquired 2 more regular customers, one of them Berta Hollins's mother, who wanted a full wardrobe refreshed. The work was steady and satisfying, and she found herself settling into Dustcreek with the ease of a person who has accidentally found the right place after searching for too long. She and Roscoe had developed a habit, neither of them having formally proposed it, of talking in the evenings. Sometimes it happened because they both ended up at Eli's store at the same time. Sometimes it happened on the bench outside the sheriff's office, which she would pass on her way back from evening errands, and he would be there. and they would sit and talk until the cold drove her back indoors. They talked about everything and nothing with an ease that she found remarkable, because she had never been the kind of person who found conversation easy with people she did not know well, and she was discovering that she now knew him well enough that the categories were blurring. She learned that he had grown up in this part of Texas, had ridden range for 4 years after his schooling, and had taken up law work because his father had been a lawman, and because it turned out he was better at settling problems with words than with fists. He was 27 years old, 3 years her senior, with a dry, quiet humor that came out in small doses and delighted her every time she caught it. He learned about her childhood on the homestead, about her mother who had died of fever when Sadie was 16, about her love of books and her difficulty finding them in sufficient quantity in small towns. He brought her a book the following Tuesday, a worn copy of a novel he had found in the back of the sheriff's office that had been left by a traveling circuit judge. She read it in 3 days, and they talked about it for a week. Geneva Alcott came into Sadie's shop in November, and Sadie served her with the same professionalism she brought to every customer, taking careful measurements for a winter riding outfit and quoting a fair price without any of the discomfort she felt on the inside showing on the outside. Geneva was handsome and composed and looked at Sadie with the particular attention of a woman assessing a potential rival, though she said nothing that could be taken directly as unfriendly. When she left, Sadie took a long breath and reminded herself that her interest in Roscoe Easton was not something she had invited or decided upon, and that Geneva Alcott's feelings on the matter were, if anything, more important than her own because Geneva had been here first. She sewed the riding outfit with perfect seams and delivered it on time, and Geneva paid her without complaint and came back 2 weeks later for a second commission. It was in late November that Roscoe asked her, somewhat formally, if she would like to come to the church social with him on the last Saturday of the month. He came to her shop to ask her, standing at the counter with his hat in his hands again. In that way she now associated with him saying something he found difficult, and she looked at him for a moment before she answered. "What about Geneva Alcott?" she asked, because she had to. Something moved across his face. "Miss Alcott and I have never made any arrangement between us," he said carefully. The expectations that some people in this town have formed on that subject came from Miss Alcott's father and not from any conversation she and I have had. I have nothing against Miss Alcott. She is a perfectly fine woman, but I have never spoken to her about any future between us, and she cannot have formed an honest expectation where none was given. Sadie considered this. It was a long and careful answer. It was also, she thought, a truthful one. "Yes," she said. "I would like to come to the social with you." The smile that came to his face then was not small or contained. It was real and full, and it did something to the room, changed the quality of the light in it somehow, and she thought, with a small interior shock, that she was in very serious trouble here and had known it for some time. The social was held in the church hall, which had been decorated with pine boughs and colored paper in a festive approximation of the Christmas season, still a month away. There was a fiddle player and a caller for the square dances, and long tables full of food that the women of the congregation had spent days preparing. Sadie wore her best dress, a deep green wool that she had made herself and that she knew fit her well, and Roscoe wore a clean dark jacket over a white shirt and looked so entirely unlike a man who spent most of his time covered in trail dust that she had to stop herself from staring. They danced twice, which was the appropriate amount for a first public occasion together, and then sat beside each other at one of the long tables and ate and talked and laughed at small things, and the whole evening had the quality of something that was both entirely ordinary and entirely significant at the same time. She was aware of people watching them. She was aware of Geneva Alcott, seated across the room, watching them with an expression that was carefully composed and not unkind but was not comfortable either. When Roscoe walked her back to her shop at the end of the evening, they stood for a moment in the cold dark outside her door. The sky above was extravagant with stars, and somewhere in the distance a coyote was announcing its existence to the night. "I had a very good evening," he said, looking down at her. "So did I," she said honestly. He reached out and, with a gentleness that seemed entirely natural from him, tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it. His hand lingered for just a moment at her cheek, barely touching, warm against her cold skin. "Good night, Sadie," he said. "Good night, Roscoe," she answered, and the sound of his name in her own voice without the formality of his title felt like crossing some small but meaningful boundary. She went inside and sat by her wood stove for a long time, not doing anything useful at all. December came, and with it the kind of cold that the Texas plains did without mercy or warning, blowing in on a blue norther that turned the streets to ice overnight and sent everyone who had business outside into as many layers of clothing as they could manage. Trade at the shop actually increased in the cold weather, people needing alterations and repairs on winter garments, and Sadie was busy enough that the days blurred together pleasantly. She and Roscoe were, by this point, understood by most of Dustcreek to be keeping company, a phrase that covered everything and nothing, and satisfied the town's need to categorize things without requiring any formal declaration from either of them. Geneva Alcott, to her credit, had not made any public scene about it, though her father had reportedly said some unflattering things about Roscoe's judgment to anyone who would listen. Roscoe himself had said nothing yet about what precisely they were to each other, and Sadie had not pushed for it. She had learned the hard way that rushing toward a thing because you were afraid of losing it was a good way to break it. Whatever this was, it was worth being careful with. What she was less careful with was the way she felt. She had stopped pretending to herself that this was a simple or manageable thing. She thought about him when he was not there, which was most of the time. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, fully, and without waiting impatiently for his turn to talk. She thought about the way he was with the townspeople he served, firm and fair in equal measure, the way he had defended the Apache riders that first day without making a speech about it. She thought about his hands and the dry humor that appeared in his eyes before it appeared anywhere else, and the way he had touched her face in the cold outside her door. It had been a long time since she had wanted anything for herself with this particular quality of ache and hope mixed together, and it frightened her, because the last time she had felt this way, it had ended very badly. She told herself this was different. She told herself that a person who notices injustice without being asked, who researches warrants in other counties before trouble actually arrives, who says that managing alone and having someone in your corner are not the same thing, and you're allowed to have both, that person is different. She was working one afternoon in mid-December when the door of the shop opened, and it was not a customer but Roscoe, and from the expression on his face she knew immediately that something was wrong. "There's news," he said, coming in and shutting the door against the cold. "A group of men, hired hands from the Alcott Ranch, have driven off a small group of Apache families who had a winter camp about 10 miles northeast of here. The camp was on land that the tribe has used since long before anyone filed a claim on it, but old man Alcott decided he wanted that stretch for grazing and had his men ride out there this morning." Sadie set down her work. "Were people hurt?" "Nobody killed," he said, his voice tight with something that was not quite anger but was in the same neighborhood. "But the camp was destroyed, belongings burned, a family with 2 small children left with almost nothing in freezing weather." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "What I can within my authority, which is not enough," he said honestly. "I can file a complaint with the county sheriff, document what was done, but the law in this territory is not particularly interested in protecting Apache families from white landowners, and we both know that." He paused. "But I am going to do what I can." She stood up. "I have blankets," she said, "and food I can put together, and I have enough fabric on these shelves to make some decent use of." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. I was going to ask if you had anything to spare, he said. I didn't want to presume. You're not presuming, she said, already moving to gather things. Help me carry. They drove out to where the displaced families had regrouped, about 5 miles from the ruined camp, in Eli Drummond's wagon because it was bigger than anything else readily available. Eli had come himself when Sadie had stopped to grab supplies and explained what had happened. He did not hesitate, simply loaded everything she had gathered onto his wagon and climbed up to drive. The families they found were cold and subdued, and regarded the approaching wagon with the wariness of people who have learned by experience that newcomers bearing gifts sometimes come with conditions attached. Roscoe spoke quietly and plainly, and one of the men, a broad-shouldered elder who spoke some English, listened and nodded. They accepted the blankets and food and fabric without ceremony, and the whole exchange had a quiet dignity to it that Sadie found herself thinking about for a long time afterward. On the drive back to town in the falling dark, sitting beside Roscoe on the wagon seat with Eli in the back, she said quietly, "You know this will not end here. Alcott is not done." "I know," Roscoe said. "And your position is complicated now. Alcott is the richest man in the county, and he was hoping you'd marry his daughter." "My position," Roscoe said, "is the same as it's always been. I enforce the law fairly, or I don't enforce it at all. A man who only does right when it's convenient for him isn't doing right at all." He paused. "And as for Geneva, I told you, there was never anything there on my end." She was quiet. Eli, bless him, was pretending to be very interested in something on the horizon. "I just want to make sure you understand what you might be giving up," she said. "I understand it very well," he said, and the way he said it, simple and direct without any drama, made it clear that he had already made his peace with the arithmetic of it. She did not say anything else, but after a moment she put her hand on the seat between them, and he put his hand over hers, and they rode back to Dustcreek that way in the cold December dark. The fallout from what had happened at the camp came faster than anyone expected. Alcott filed a complaint with the county sheriff, claiming that his men had removed trespassers from his property within the law. And the county sheriff, who was not a bad man but was a cautious one with an eye on his own position, declined to make any formal inquiry into the matter. Roscoe filed his documentation anyway and sent a copy to the territorial governor's office, which he knew might accomplish nothing, but which he was going to do regardless. What he did not expect was that Alcott would take the matter to the town council and suggest, in terms that were polite but entirely clear, that the deputy's continuing usefulness to the town of Dustcreek was in question given his recent activities and his evident poor judgment in personal matters. Sheriff Alderman, who had a bad knee and a strong preference for calm, found himself in an uncomfortable position. Sadie heard about the council meeting from Berta Hollins, who heard about it from her husband, who was on the council. She went directly to Roscoe. He was at his desk in the sheriff's office, writing something in his careful hand. He looked up when she came in, and his expression told her he already knew. "They won't do anything," he said before she could speak. "Alcott can make noise, but he can't actually compel the sheriff to dismiss a deputy without cause, and there is no legitimate cause." "That is not the point," she said, sitting down across from him. "The point is that he is going to keep making trouble for you, and it is going to follow you." "I know," he said. "Are you worried?" He considered this honestly. "About the job, no. About you," he said, meeting her eyes directly, "yes, because you have worked hard to build something here, and if Alcott decides to make your life difficult by association with me, that is a real harm to you." She stared at him. "That is what you are worried about, not your own situation but mine." "Yours is more precarious than mine," he said simply. "You are new here, still establishing yourself. I have 2 years of goodwill with most of this town. You have 4 months. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Roscoe, I'm not going to step back from this because of what Alcott thinks." "I know you're not," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved again. "I wasn't suggesting you should. I was just being honest about what I was worried about." She looked at him across the desk, this steady, careful man with his dark eyes and his plain way of saying exactly what he meant, and she thought, this is a person worth standing next to. This is a person worth everything it might cost. I am not afraid of trouble, she said. I have had plenty of practice. He stood up from his desk and came around it, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something momentous. Instead, he simply reached out and touched her hand where it lay on the desk, just his fingers over hers, and looked at her with an expression that was more unguarded than she had ever seen on him. I know you're not, he said quietly. That is one of approximately 100 things I admire about you. She felt the color come into her face and was irritated by it. Only approximately 100. This time the smile came fully, warm and real, and she thought she could probably stand here for a considerable amount of time and not find it any less remarkable. December deepened into the cold weeks before Christmas, and Dustcreek decorated itself with whatever it had on hand, which was pine boughs, some paper chains, and lanterns hung outside the businesses along the main street. Sadie's shop was busy with people wanting new clothes for the holiday, and she worked long hours with a satisfaction that felt earned. Roscoe came by in the evenings when his duties allowed. Sometimes he brought wood for her stove, which she told him was unnecessary, and which she privately appreciated more than she said. They had Christmas dinner at the Drummond house along with 6 other people, seated around a long table that required every chair Eli owned and 2 barrels dragged in from the storage room. And it was loud and warm and full of food and laughter. And at one point, Sadie caught Roscoe watching her from across the table with an expression so open and so certain that she had to look away before the feeling it caused got too large to manage. He walked her home in the cold, clear Christmas night, and this time when they stopped outside her door, it was not awkward or tentative. He turned to face her and said, with the directness that was simply his nature, I want to tell you something and I want to do it plainly. All right, she said. Her heart was beating very fast. I have been thinking clearly about what I want for a long time, he said. I am not a man who acts on feelings he hasn't examined, but I have examined them and they are not going to change, and I think you deserve to know that. I am in love with you, Sadie Gentry. Not in the early, uncertain way, but in the way that's already decided and already settled in me. The cold air was sharp, and the stars were out, and somewhere a horse in a nearby stable made a quiet sound. She looked up at him and felt everything she had been holding carefully behind her composure for months simply let go. I have been frightened, she said honestly. I have been frightened because the last time I felt this way I was very wrong about the person, and being wrong that way costs a great deal. I know, he said. But I have watched you, she continued, for months. I have watched what kind of man you are when it is easy and when it is not easy, and I know the difference now. And I would have to work very hard not to be in love with you back. He smiled, and she smiled, and he cupped her face in both his hands and kissed her gently in the cold Christmas dark, and it was the most right thing that had happened to her in longer than she could properly account for. January brought new snow, which was unusual enough for this part of Texas, that the whole town came out to stare at it, and then spent the next several days dealing with the practical inconveniences of frozen water troughs and slippery boardwalks. Sadie sold more mended coats in January than she had in any previous month, and she opened the shop early and closed it late, and felt the pleasant tiredness of someone whose labor is genuinely useful. She and Roscoe were, by January, no longer a subject of speculation, but simply a fact of the town's fabric. He ate dinner with her at the Drummond house on Sunday evenings. They were seen together regularly enough that it would have been news if they were not. Alcott's grumblings had faded, partly because his formal complaint had gone nowhere, and partly because even he seemed to recognize that the majority of Dustcreek regarded Roscoe with a good deal of loyalty. Geneva Alcott had not been rude to Sadie again, but neither had she been particularly warm. There was a Sunday in January when Geneva came into the shop for an additional alteration, and the 2 women were alone together briefly, and Geneva looked at her with an expression that was tired and honest and said, He never actually looked at me the way he looks at you, you know. I told myself it would come with time. I was wrong." She paused. "I'm not angry at you. I wanted you to know that." Sadie was not sure what to say, and so she said the most honest thing available. "I am sorry it happened the way it did. You deserved better than to have expectations built around you without your full participation." Geneva made a small sound that might have been a rueful laugh. "He never made me any promises," she admitted. "My father did most of the promising. Roscoe just never bothered to correct the assumption loudly enough." She looked at the fabric on the table between them. "He is a good man, I hope you know that." "I do," Sadie said. "Good," Geneva said, and that was the end of it. February arrived with a warmth that felt premature and beautiful. The kind of day in February that makes you trust spring is real even though you know better. Roscoe came to the shop midway through a Tuesday morning and stood at the counter and turned his hat in his hands. And Sadie recognized the gesture now for what it was and felt a warmth spread through her. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. "I want to ask you properly," he said, almost reproachfully. She bit her lip to stop the smile. "I'm listening." He looked at her with that direct, unguarded quality that she loved in him, the way he was always precisely himself, no more and no less. "Sadie Gentry," he said, "I would like you to marry me. Not because the town expects it or because it is the next logical step in anything, but because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in all my years of being alive, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in your immediate vicinity. I would like to build something with you. I am not a rich man, and this is not a dramatic territory for grand gestures, but I mean every word of what I am saying, and you can trust that completely." She came around the counter. She put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him steadily for a moment. This good, plain-spoken, principled man who had stood in doorways and filed complaints with county sheriffs and touched her hair in the cold dark, and she said, "Yes, Roscoe Easton, yes, without a single reservation." He kissed her right there in the middle of the shop, with the February sunshine coming through the windows and a half-finished lady's suit on the cutting table behind her. And it was completely perfect. They were married in April, at the Dustcreek church, on a morning when the wildflowers were coming up along every fence line, and the air smelled of grass and distance. Eli Drummond walked her down the aisle because she had no father living and he had offered, and she had accepted with genuine gratitude. Roscoe stood at the front of the church in a clean dark suit with his hat off, and his dark eyes fixed on her from the moment she appeared in the doorway, with an expression that made her feel like the only person in the room. They said their vows in front of the whole town, or most of it, because Dustcreek had few enough entertainments that a wedding was a serious occasion. Berta Hollins cried, which started several other women crying, and even Eli had to clear his throat with particular force at a couple of points. The reception was held in the churchyard in the warm spring air, with 3 different people playing fiddle at various points and food that covered 2 long tables and lasted until well into the afternoon. Sadie cut the first piece of wedding cake and handed it to her husband and looked at him saying that word in her own head, husband, and found that it did not frighten her at all. It felt like the right-sized word for the right-sized thing. They lived for the first months in the back rooms of the Seamstress shop, which was cozy if not spacious, and Roscoe's contributions to the household were practical and immediate. He fixed the back door that had always stuck in damp weather, and put up better shelving in the workroom, and rebuilt the stack on the wood stove to draw more efficiently, and none of these things were romantic in themselves. But the cumulative effect of them was that she was building a life with a person whose instinct when he loved something was to take care of it, and she found this deeply and genuinely moving. By summer they had saved enough, combined with what she had been earning steadily, to put a deposit on a small house 3 streets back from the main road. It was not much to look at from the outside, but it had 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and a backyard with a big cottonwood tree that threw shade in the afternoon, and Sadie walked through it on the day they signed the papers and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She moved her shop into slightly larger premises that autumn, having outgrown the original space, and hired a young woman named Patience Caro to help with the workload. Patience was 17 when she started, 18 the following March, and she turned out to have a natural eye for detail that made her very good at the work. Sadie taught her everything she knew about fitting and construction, and the shop became a genuine going concern rather than just a one-woman operation. Roscoe's work had its troubles, as it always did. The county was growing, which meant more disputes and more need for careful law. There was a period in the autumn when a gang of cattle thieves working the eastern range kept him out long hours and away from home more than either of them liked. But he was not reckless, and he came home every time, and she was there when he did, and that was the shape of things. They argued occasionally about real things, about money once, about a decision he had made without consulting her about a matter that affected them both, about her tendency to take on more work than she could comfortably manage when the demand was high. They argued with the honest directness of two people who respected each other enough not to dress up their real feelings, and they resolved things the same way, plainly, and without carrying the residue of it forward into the next day. She had been frightened, she knew, that marriage would eventually dissolve into the kind of quiet mutual dissatisfaction she had experienced before, the kind that feels like peace until you realize it is really just absence. What she found instead was that being with Roscoe was full, continuously and genuinely full. He surprised her regularly, with small observations and unexpected kindnesses, and the dry humor that she never quite got tired of catching. In the spring of 1880, she discovered she was going to have a baby. She told him on a Sunday evening after dinner, sitting in the kitchen of their little house with the back door open to the cool air, and the cottonwood outside moving gently. She had known for 2 weeks and had been turning it over in herself, not afraid exactly but serious about it, aware of everything it would change. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, and then he set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she did not have adequate words for. It was wonder and tenderness and something almost like gravity, the look of a man understanding fully the weight of a thing. "Are you all right?" he asked first. "Yes," she said, "very much so." He stood and came to her and pulled her up from her chair and held her with a gentleness that she felt from the top of her head to the floor, and she pressed her face into the front of his shirt and breathed. "I am going to be terrified every day of my life," he said quietly into her hair. "That is extremely honest," she said, "and happy," he added, "both things at once." Their son was born in October of 1880 in the first chill of autumn, delivered by the doctor who served Dustcreek and also 3 neighboring settlements. He was a healthy, loud child with Roscoe's dark hair and what looked like it might be Sadie's green eyes, though it was too early to be certain. They named him Thomas, after Roscoe's father, and called him Tom from the very first day. Eli Drummond came to see the baby the day after the birth and stood in the doorway of their bedroom looking at the small bundle in Sadie's arms with the expression of a man who has successfully contained his emotion by about 3%. His wife, who had become one of Sadie's closest friends by this point, cried freely and handed everyone else permission to do the same. Roscoe held his son on the evening of his birth, sitting in the rocking chair in the bedroom with the lamplight warm and the world outside doing whatever it liked, and Sadie watched him from her pillow and thought that this was one of those moments that belonged to itself entirely, that would not be improved upon by any addition or change. The town responded to the baby with the particular enthusiasm of a community that had watched these two people find each other and considered the whole arc of it their own minor triumph. Berta brought a quilt. Patience made a small set of clothes. 3 different families brought food. Eli arrived with 2 bottles of wine, which he admitted he had been saving since a shipment came through entirely by accident, and which he had decided immediately were for exactly this occasion. The years that followed were full ones. Tom grew into a sturdy, curious child with his father's steadiness and his mother's way of asking questions that cut to the center of things. The shop continued to grow. Dustcreek grew with it, the railway coming through in 1881, which brought new people and new commerce and made everything both more prosperous and more complicated. Roscoe was elected sheriff in 1882, when old Alderman's knee finally gave out entirely, and he retired to the modest farm he had always talked about. The election was not a contest. The town knew what it had in Roscoe Easton and voted accordingly. He accepted the position with the same matter-of-fact gravity he brought to everything, and wore the sheriff's star with the same plain competence he had brought to the deputy's one. On the day he was officially sworn in, Sadie stood in the little crowd gathered outside the courthouse and watched him take his oath with his hand on the Bible and his face serious and clean in the autumn light. And she thought about the first morning she had ridden into Dustcreek with nothing but a saddlebag full of broken promises and a heart still raw from betrayal, and how she could not possibly have imagined from that particular vantage point that this was where the road was going. She was glad she had not known. She thought it might have been too large to hope for. In the winter of 1883, she found out she was expecting again. This time she was less afraid of telling him, though she still felt the particular solemnity of carrying important news to an important person. He responded much as he had the first time, with the quiet gravity and the uncontained warmth, and this time also with a 5-year-old Tom sitting on the floor nearby playing with a set of wooden horses, and completely unaware that the world was about to shift slightly on his axis. Their daughter was born in July of 1883, in the heat of a Texas summer that kept the whole household sweating, and the doors thrown open to whatever breeze offered itself. They named her Clara, after Sadie's mother, and she arrived into the world at considerable volume, and immediately demonstrated a will of iron that would characterize her for the entirety of her life. Tom regarded his new sister with an initial suspicion that dissolved within about 2 weeks into a protectiveness, so fierce it occasionally needed to be reined in. Roscoe said it was the most familiar thing he had ever seen, and Sadie threw a dish towel at him. Dustcreek in 1884 was a different town from the one Sadie had ridden into 6 years before. It had a railway station, a proper school, 2 churches, a newspaper, and enough permanence to suggest it was going to outlast the century. The seamstress shop had moved to its 3rd and largest location, a proper storefront with 4 workstations and 3 employees, including patients who had by now been with Sadie for 4 years and could run most of the operation herself on a given day. Sadie had built exactly what she had intended to build. She knew this with the satisfaction of a woman who had set out deliberately and worked deliberately and arrived somewhere real. But the truth that surprised her, the one she had not known to expect, was that the building she was proudest of was not the shop, though the shop was good and honest work. It was the life itself, the house with the cottonwood tree, the kitchen table where they ate together every morning, the way Tom came home from school and went directly to whatever his father was working on, and the way Roscoe always stopped to give him his full attention. The way Clara's laugh, even at 1 year old, could rearrange the mood of an entire room. One evening in the late autumn of 1884, Sadie was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and a book open in front of her, though she had not been reading it for the last several minutes. She was listening to the sound of the house around her, Tom asleep in his room, Clara asleep in the cradle that was now too small for her, but that neither of them had moved yet because she still fit well enough and there was no hurry. Roscoe's boots on the porch steps as he came in from the night. He came through the kitchen door and hung up his hat and jacket and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and then came and sat down across from her at the table and looked at her in that particular way he had, full and direct and entirely itself. "Good day," she asked. "Decent enough," he said. "Old Pratt's fence dispute has been resolved. The Hendersons are not going to burn each other's buildings down after all." "Progress," she said. He smiled. She loved his smile after all these years, still with a freshness that made no logical sense and that she had stopped trying to explain. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, because he always asked when she had the look she currently had. She considered. "That I am very lucky," she said. "And that lucky is the wrong word because luck implies you didn't do the work and we did the work. So perhaps grateful is better." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Both," he said. "Lucky and grateful both." They sat that way for a while, in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning and the autumn wind moving past the windows and the children sleeping soundly in the house around them. And Sadie thought that this was the whole of it, this right here. Not the beginning of something or the middle, but the thing itself, full and real and entirely hers. In 1885, the Apache elder who had nodded to Roscoe on that cold December day came to Dustcreek for the first time in 3 years. His name, they learned through the English speaker who accompanied him, was Running Wolf, and he had come to speak to the sheriff about a new encroachment further north. A land agent working on behalf of Eastern investors who were systematically documenting range that native families had used for generations and filing claims on it. Roscoe listened for 2 full hours and took careful notes, and then spent the next 3 weeks sending telegrams and letters to every office he had contact with, up to and including the territorial governor again. The land agent's operation was eventually flagged by federal authorities for a number of irregularities, and while the outcome was not perfect, because the outcomes in these situations were rarely perfect, some of the families were able to maintain access to the most critical portions of their land. Running Wolf sent a message to Roscoe through the same English-speaking companion, a brief acknowledgement that was nevertheless genuine. Roscoe kept it in the same desk drawer where he kept the original documentation from the camp incident in 1878. He never spoke about these things as if they were causes or positions. He spoke about them, when he spoke about them at all, as what they were, which was simply the correct thing to do, the obvious extension of applying the same fairness to everyone that his office required of him. This consistency, which he wore so lightly that it barely showed, was the thing Sadie had seen in him earliest and admired most lastingly, the thing that had told her, before she had words for any of the rest of it, that here was a person she could trust. The spring of 1886 brought news that Roscoe's sister in Fort Worth was seriously ill, and he rode out to see her, a long trip that kept him away for 10 days. Sadie managed the household and the shop and the children and the various demands of being the sheriff's wife in the sheriff's absence, and when he came home, his sister was recovering, and he arrived looking thin and relieved simultaneously. He walked through the kitchen door, and Tom crashed into him at knee height, and Clara, who was now 3 years old and had opinions about everything, held out her arms in absolute expectation of being picked up immediately. Roscoe picked up both children at once somehow and looked at Sadie over their heads, and she crossed the kitchen and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and breathed him in. "How is she?" Sadie asked. "Better," he said. "Weak but better. She sends you her love. I will write to her this week. She'd like that." He put the children down and they ran off about their business, and he sat down at the kitchen table and looked around at the room, at the clean order of it, at the evidence of daily life in every detail, at his wife moving between the stove and the counter, and he said quietly, "I thought about you the whole time I was there." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Roscoe Easton, sentimental." "Always," he said simply, and meant it absolutely. By 1887, Tom was starting school and demonstrating a particular aptitude for mathematics that none of his teachers quite knew what to make of. And Clara was speaking in complete and elaborate sentences, and had developed a deep personal attachment to the horses in the livery stable that meant at least 3 times a week she had to be retrieved from there, by whoever noticed her absence first. Sadie kept a running inventory of the small daily chaos of their life, with a satisfaction she had never expected to feel about chaos. The shop was thriving. Patience had married a young man who worked at the railway depot and was expecting their first child, and Sadie had taken on 2 more seamstresses to keep pace with the work. She was, by any reasonable measure, a successful businesswoman in a town that had watched her build that success from the ground up, and she was aware of this and valued it without letting it become the whole of her. She had kept her independence the whole way through. Roscoe had never suggested she do otherwise, which was one of the things she had come to understand she had needed, not just loved, about him. The shop was hers. He never interfered with it, never gave opinions on it unless asked, never made her feel that her ambitions were secondary to the business of being a wife and mother. She was both and she was neither. She was herself entirely, and that remained true. On a warm evening in September of 1887, almost exactly 9 years from the day she had ridden into Dustcreek with a saddlebag full of broken promises, Sadie sat on the front porch of their house in the late light with a cup of tea going cold beside her. Tom was in the yard throwing a stick for the dog they had acquired somewhat accidentally last spring, a rangy hound who was useless for anything except being loved. Clara was on the porch step below Sadie's feet, drawing something in the dirt with a twig with fierce concentration. Roscoe came out through the front door and sat down in the chair beside hers, and for a moment they just watched the yard together, Tom and the dog making circuits between the cottonwood and the fence. "Do you remember the day I came into your shop with that bolt of calico?" he said. She looked at him. "I remember. I had been watching you for 2 weeks by that point," he said. "I kept finding reasons to walk past the shop." She felt the laugh come up from somewhere warm. "I suspected as much. Did you?" "You are not always as subtle as you think you are," she said affectionately. He made a quiet noise that was equal parts protest and amusement. "I thought I was very subtle. You passed the shop 4 times one Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment. "There were things I needed to think through," he said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything." "And were you certain?" "By the time I came in with the calico, yes," he said, "completely." She reached out and found his hand on the arm of his chair, and his fingers closed around hers with the ease of something done 10,000 times. Clara looked up from her dirt drawing and regarded her parents with the frank appraisal of a 4-year-old. "Are you and Papa talking about being in love again?" she asked. "Yes," Sadie said very solemnly. Clara returned to her drawing. "Good," she said, apparently satisfied. Tom, from across the yard, did not look up from the dog, but he said with elaborate casualness, "You do that all the time." "Does it bother you?" Roscoe asked. Tom threw the stick again. "No," he said. "It's okay." Sadie and Roscoe looked at each other, and the laughter came quietly, just between them, in the warm September evening with the dog barking and the cottonwood moving overhead, and the whole of their shared life spread around them like a landscape, solid and real and entirely theirs. There would be more years to come, she knew. More seasons of work and worry and the small, essential pleasures of a life built honestly and kept with care. There would be hard seasons, because life in this country did not allow otherwise, and there would be easy ones, and there would be the ordinary Tuesdays that were neither hard nor easy, but simply full and continuous and real. Tom would grow and Clara would grow, and the town would grow and the world outside it would change in ways none of them could entirely predict. But sitting here, in this particular evening, with her husband's hand in hers and her children nearby, and the light going golden over everything, Sadie Gentry, who had ridden into this town with nothing but loss behind her and uncertainty ahead, understood with a certainty that asked nothing of the future at all that she was, precisely and completely, home.